When I received the presidential appointment, I felt honored, and I also felt kind of challenged. And I wondered if what I had experienced here in Arkansas in the governor's office for those 10 years would be of application, because it was such a different experience. So my beginning experience as an emergency manager was that when we were actually in the transition period, there was a tornado that hit Clinton, Arkansas. And it wiped out the center of the city, which had just been revitalized and restored. And so that's kind of, a situation where he's been elected, but he's not the governor, Governor White. And so you didn't want to step on Governor White's toes. He didn't own it so much. He didn't do too much about it. Governor-elect Clinton wanted to go there, so he went there, and he couldn't promise anything because he wasn't yet governor. So the moment I get my job, which is Senior Assistant for Intergovernmental Relations, I am to apply for FEMA assistance. And FEMA rejected the request, just like that most recent rejection here. And so what do? And so I called the Office of Emergency Services in Conway. They were in underground. They were more for national defense than they were emergency management, but emergency management was under them. And they said, well, you can always apply for assistance from FEMA. So, okay. So I put together a request documenting the problems and the cost and the estimated recovery, and sent it, and they rejected it. And so I said, what do we do now? And the guy at OES said, well, you appeal the rejection. So I wrote a nice appeal to the rejection, and they rejected the appeal to the rejection. And so Governor Clinton is not going to have that. So he says, well, okay, you know what you're going to have to do now? And I said, no, what? And he said, well, we're going to have a town hall meeting, and let's invite all of the people from the Clinton and that area to come to the meeting. Okay. And he said, and let's invite all the federal agencies to come tell us what they're going to do for Clinton, Arkansas. And so I said, oh, that's a great idea. So they're all stationed here in Little Rock and have an office. And he said, we should have a town hall meeting. Let's invite everybody from that area. So we did. And 1,000 people showed up. And all the agencies showed up, including FEMA from Texas. But I got really scared because I thought, what am I going to do? How am I going to be able to chair that meeting with all those people? And they were so hot at FEMA. And so the governor says, well, can you think of somebody to co-chair it with you? And I said, well, my first choice would be Senator Bumpers, because he's on the FEMA Appropriations Committee. He said, genius. Okay, see if he'll do it. So I called him up, and Bumpers said, hell yes. And so we had a good time chairing that meeting. And the people were so responsive, and the federal agencies stood out. They talked about all the things they were going to do for Clinton, and it was just magical. And so I'm driving the 100 miles back to Little Rock, and I say, this is like more fun than any other part of my job. So, I mean, that didn't last too long, I guess, because there were so many jobs to do in the governor's office, as you can imagine. And so eventually from that meeting, the agencies came together, and they worked together really well. And they liked that FEMA basically offered and was open about accepting their assistance and coordinating with them and staying in touch and forming a kind of a team spirit. And it was quite different because the Office of Emergency Services was, really preparing for the bomb from Russia. They were not like public outreach and stuff like that, so they were not so comfortable with it. But they just said, just like, let us know what we need to do, and they didn't try to lead it or deal with it, basically. And so I felt really comfortable with it because my friend Catherine Henshaw, who grew up across the street from me in Tawnytown, his father was Jerry Henshaw, who was chair of the Republican Senate delegation, House delegation. And she and I had been political science, public administration majors at the U of A, as well as next door neighbors. And she had gotten a job from Governor Clinton the year before he became governor as local government services department, which was later abolished by Governor White. But her job was to put together a retirement plan for firefighters and police officers. And so she was really uncomfortable with this job. And she said, Kay, they're asking me lots of questions about state government, local government, about history and stuff like that. And I wonder if you would come to some of our meetings. So I came, and we had really great conversations. And we developed a retirement system, which is now in place and has been in place for all these years since the 80s, that is the model for police and fire retirement systems throughout the country. And it's the most prosperous retirement system in Arkansas state government. And so when I went to on the transition team for the governor's office, those police and fire were always coming by my office and asking different questions and making suggestions and being very supportive and everything. And so that's why Betsy Wright decided you're going to have to run with emergency management. And so that's exactly what happened. So when I received the appointment, it was, preparing for the confirmation hearing and such. And my FEMA staff prepared that, and I edited it a little bit, and I made the presentation. And one of the senators who happened to be chairing the committee said, no, Ms. Goss, that's a nice FEMA presentation you've given. What I want to know is what would you do? There's a disaster, so what would you do? And I said, well, I'm in charge of planning and preparedness and training and exercises. So I hope that I've already done a lot of work, and that is the training part and the exercise part and the planning part. And so I will know who the stars are, and I will know the best practices, and I will share that. And he said, but how are you going to share that? And I said, well, I'm going to spend a lot of time out with the different states and local governments. And he said, okay. I move that we pass this nomination by unanimous consent, and they did. And what they wanted to hear was FEMA had somebody who was willing to relate to state and locals. Well, that was really easy because James Lee had been, the director of emergency management statewide in Arkansas, and he's very much engaged in outreach. And the other people that he had appointed were all emergency management experienced people. And that was, that doesn't sound like it's revolutionary, but it is, because we were all the first round of people at the top level that actually had experience and actually had a feel for it. And, when firefighters would come into our office, I could tell them about the 100 fire departments that we had created in Arkansas during the governor's tenure in office, and how we had a program that supported fire trucks from the surplus equipment that DF&A would have, and we would send them to the prison, and they would paint them red, and they would repair them mechanically, and they would add a ladder, and each fire department would get one of those if they wanted it. and they would owe the state $10,000, but they could work out their own payment plan. And I remember the mayor of Birdi saying, "What is the most lenient plan you can think of?" And I said, "Well, how about $100 a month? Or maybe, if that's too much, maybe $1,000 every other year." He said, "Sold." So we had, small departments like that needed state assistance, and we provided it. And the federal government was very supportive of that, especially the Forestry Commission, because so many of those rural communities were in areas that had forests. And those days of FEMA turning down requests was kind of over, because you had a governor who was president and a former state emergency management director who was the head of FEMA, and then me, whatever you call me, there, with the planning, training, and exercises. And to show you what my goals were and priorities, the first meeting that I had with the division directors in that directorate was I asked the planning director, or the training director, to stay afterwards so we could talk. And I said, "How many people can FEMA train?" My brain is thinking, I'm going to get the people in Arkansas who couldn't get training here to get the training there. And he said, 5,000. I said, "Oh, no. 5,000 even?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "That must mean you're turning down people." He said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Well, how many do you estimate you're turning down a year?" And he said, "Oh, it's over 5,000. And I said, "Oh, we can't do it anymore." He said, "How are you going to train? We don't have the staff, we don't have the funding to train 10,000 people. And I said, "Well, we have a director of FEMA and a president of the United States who will support us if we make a reasonable request." And so we did, and they supported it. And I said, "But, as we ramp up this training, have you had any ideas about how FEMA could expand it to be inclusive of other organizations that could help us do that training?" He said, "Well, I have one idea, but you're not going to want it." And I said, "Oh, I do want it." And he said, "Well, we have a great relationship with Frederick County Community College. It's just 14 miles south of the Emergency Management Institute Training Center. And they accredit our courses and we accredit theirs." And I said, "Oh, I like that. What if we could get one of those in every state?" And he said, "Well, you probably can't do that. That would take all of your time doing that." And I said, "No, I don't think so." Because being an academician originally from different institutions here in Arkansas, I felt really comfortable with that. And so I started working on that. And we provided materials. We provided an annual conference, and the professors came in every year. And that's been going on 27 years. Now, FEMA has canceled this year's conference, but the one for next year is still on. And Arkansas Tech, which was one of our first institutions to start offering emergency management degree programs, is making their electronic system available for the professors from around the country to still collaborate this year, even though FEMA is no longer sponsoring it. And Arkansas Tech actually became one of the first to go through the process of becoming accredited as in an emergency management undergraduate and graduate program. Now there are 600 institutions around the country that offer those degree programs, and all of them are going through that accreditation process in one way or another. And speaking of accreditation, we believe in accreditation, and it's one way that states have of showing their capabilities. And so we started something called the Emergency Management Accreditation Program. And that's headquartered in Kentucky. It's with the state government's organization. And it is like booming. Every state, all 50 states have gone through this highly laborative process of becoming accredited and offering these strong capabilities. Now, with FEMA, I think everybody kind of has an idea of what the agency could and should be doing. It's not like EPA or even the Department of Education to some extent, or Department of Defense. It is an agency that people can relate to because they see disasters coming and going, and they see people not being able to afford to recover and that kind of thing. And they're hoping that FEMA can fill in those voids. And you know, it almost never happens that everybody is happy. So that is one thing that they deal with all of the time. And so we've had several different backgrounds of presidents, and each of them have a different view of this. And President Trump is a businessman, and he's looking at the dollars, and we're spending about $30 billion a year on disaster recovery. And I'm pretty sure that he, you know, is going to have one opinion, whereas Governor Clinton, when he became president, he saw the people that he had seen go through the disaster, and he would see it as, you know, an investment in those people and in that recovery. But that's a delicate thing that I don't think many presidents had that background or that feeling. So in looking at what we can do now with FEMA, I know I have a meeting with them the end of this month, and it's to look at lessons learned through the years. And, you know, President Trump had one of the best emergency managers in the country serve as the head of FEMA, Craig Fugate. Craig Fugate I met when he was still a volunteer firefighter in Florida. He actually had grown up in the fire department. His family was so poor they did not have a home. And so he lived in the fire department. And he went up through the ranks and became a full-time paid firefighter, and then he became assistant emergency manager for Florida, and then he became the director of Florida. And so when he came in as a director of FEMA, he was a big advocate. And President Trump, when he came in for the first term, he named Brock Long. And Brock Long was somebody that I met when he was in charge of school emergency preparedness in Georgia. And then he moved to Alabama, where he was an assistant director, and he became director. And he was Alabama's director when we had that oil spill down in the Caribbean. And he oversaw that. So he knew things from small rural disasters to large catastrophic international disasters, really, with that spill. So we've had all kinds of strong emergency managers as head of FEMA and some that were a little bit weaker. But all of them, I think, have been well-intentioned, and that's true for also the presidents. And it's just a different perspective. And the interesting thing about FEMA is, I think, unlike other agencies, is everybody, including everyone in this room, probably has a little bit different perspective about what they would like to see FEMA do and be. And you don't see that so much about DOD. You don't see that so much even about the Department of Education. People wonder what they do sometimes. And so that is my overall perspective of the situation. And I would like to be able to answer questions that you may have or comments that you might have about that.
What do you see as the strengths that FEMA should be doing for states, and what do you think states should be doing for themselves? And it's truly meant in a neutral way.
Well, I think that communication is the most important thing. And I want FEMA to be confident because they do have a lot of authority and a lot of freedom. And they can advise the president in any way they see fit. So choose a good emergency manager to be the head of FEMA and stick with the profession of emergency management for advice. And don't let the political winds blow it one way or the other. I know that's unrealistic, but you know, I learned something from Congressman Mills and Dale Bumpers, Jim Guy Tucker, a lot of the people that I worked with and supported through the years, that bleeds over in my thinking on this. But I think you need to just keep the conversations going. Don't, you know, call each other names. Don't make assumptions without knowledge. And, you know, and let's help each other. And the thing that I enjoyed most about FEMA, in fact, it was just like a blessing every single day, was that people with problems would come to my office or call or write or whatever. And the same is true with all the other administrators there. And there were ways we could help them, or we could find out who in FEMA they should be going to, you know, and just help people weave through the bureaucracy. So that's what I call on my successors to do, is to be open and hear the problems, because there is no way you can sit behind your desk in DC and understand all of the problems. And people come up with amazing controversies, amazing difficulties, challenges, and, you know, hear it out and think of ways that you can help them in some way. If it's not through FEMA itself, another agency.
We often see things that maybe the current administration's doing that seem like they've never been done before. But you have examples of very similar, you know, shifts or tides that kind of turn FEMA's attention. You mentioned 9/11 and Katrina. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about that story? And
Yes. So, you know, we're rocking along in the 90s, and we think we're solving every problem, and we're reaching out, and we're being collaborative, and everything is really smooth. And 9/11 occurs. And all of a sudden, when they pass a budget for the Department of Homeland Security, you know, so we're asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars, or maybe 2 or 3 million here or there. And, you know, they pass a budget of 100 million right off for one kind of disaster. And so we're just kind of breathtaking. And so we don't know, you know, what to do. And so my higher education director, after I had left the agency, asked me to join 4 or 5 other people that had some higher ed experience or some FEMA experience or some state experience to come form a sort of a think tank. And the thing that we were asked to do by FEMA was come up with some principles of emergency management. So we did that. And it was like, and I said to my guy that had been higher ed director for me, I said, you know, do you think that we are ever going to get off this Homeland Security kick so that we can get some money back to emergency management? And he said, oh yeah, as soon as there's national disaster that gets their public's attention. And really soon after that, Katrina happened. And so we said, okay, you know, not that we're glad that New Orleans had to go through that, but it focused Congress, the president, and everybody else on, okay, this can happen anytime. And it hurt so many people for so long. And, you know, thank goodness for Walmart, who came through with 79 18-wheelers from this guy that graduated from our classes at Arkansas Tech. that was an actual emergency manager in charge of that. And that was a great example. I was down to speak to the Arkansas Emergency Management Association the day that hit. And I never spoke because all of us left and we went out to the street and started collecting food and diapers and such for New Orleans.
So this administration is being cited as encouraging states to provide more funding and not relying on federal aid,
Yeah.
especially within the most recent flooding, tornadoes, et cetera, here in Arkansas. So kind of as a follow-up question to the first question that was asked, do you feel like Arkansas is well-suited to take on some of these tasks? Do we need to change anything? Do we need to embrace anything? Or what would you say a good outlook is to providing relief for families who are negatively affected by these events?
Well, I think that it's very hard for states to take on that responsibility when the disaster is so widespread. And, FEMA, and first of all, a lot of people don't understand that FEMA is taking care of the people that don't have insurance. I had a niece who called after a disaster out in the Heights, and I said, well, she said, what do we ask for? What can we ask for? And I said, well, anything damage that you have that's not covered by insurance. She said, what? She thought, okay, we've got insurance, so we're doing everything we can do, so that should be rewarded. But actually, FEMA, the way the legislation's written, rewards those that don't have insurance. So that's hard for people to understand. And then for the longest time, and all the time I was there, if you wanted to apply for disaster assistance, you had to apply to the business administration. And people would say, but I'm not a business. I'm not even incorporated. I'm just a person. Well, you have to be turned down by them before you can be funded by FEMA. So there were these little things that through the years needed to be cleared up because it made it really hard for people.
You talked about how critical communication is in emergency management situations. And we now live in a world where people don't always trust what they hear from state or federal government, and then they hear all kinds of truths and lies and half-truths on social media. So what role does FEMA and even the state governments play in helping to make sure that regular people out here on the ground who are impacted or could be impacted by disasters hear the truth and hear what FEMA is actually able to do and how they can take advantage of that program?
Well, I'm a big advocate of emergency management personnel being huge on outreach at all times, because I do think people want to talk about their questions and they want to understand some things that are not clear necessarily. And journalists don't always get it either, so they need to take some of those classes that are offered in emergency management to understand some of the nuances of the rules and regs that apply. And then those change pretty often, so it's hard to follow that. And if you're a person who's living your life in your job or your profession or whatever, you're not going to necessarily keep up with that. So I think we can't do enough outreach. So I'm a big advocate of that. And just talking through the challenges that we face together.
The FEMA, I guess, deals with a lot of contracts.
Yes.
And you hear, I met, when I was in Katrina, meet people from all over, and it's a lot of money involved with those contracts. And then you hear over the years, there's a lot of graft. How does FEMA determine when they hear outsourcing those contracts, who they're going to use?
Well, so I was head of preparedness training and exercises, but there's also a mitigation directorate and a response directorate and a recovery directorate. And when I first went there was a response and recovery directorate. It was put together. And then it was realized that the people that are working on the response side of it don't have a whole lot in common with the people working on the recovery side of it. They're worried about, food and shelter and long-term rebuilding and that kind of thing, whereas the response people are, working with fire departments and police departments and getting out there and have, our national search and recovery teams and things like that. So I think the important thing is to get, like we were talking about, getting out there, talking to people about who you see, and the State Office of Emergency Management is very, they're very accessible. So I think you all can depend upon contacting them and getting some good information. And, you as a citizen shouldn't be bearing the burden of getting that information. We as public officials need to be very proactive in that process. And I'm a big believer in that. It's a hard job and it's 24/7, 365, but it needs to be done.
What was the biggest disaster you dealt with when you were at FEMA?
Well, I guess the one that challenged me the first and the foremost was the Oklahoma City bombing, because children were killed. And I was working with search and rescue teams, and I was very close to the Arizona director of the teams, and I would talk to him every day because he insisted that he talked to somebody who was not on that site. He said, my eyes have gone gray, my skin is gray, and I'm short-tempered with everybody. And he said, I know you're an understanding person and you have some information. I want to tell you what's actually going on. And so to this day, we stay in contact once a day. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? Oh, I'm fine. Just because that worked for us to get through that, because we were both so frantic about, the children being carried out of the daycare center, some dead, some alive. It's just, we had a police officer in Oklahoma City who worked all day and all night. And he was very, very established and respected. And he started being absent from work. And they knew he had taken this very hard. And so they were somewhat lenient, more than they would have been ordinarily. And then he started becoming an alcoholic. And then he got a divorce. And then he committed suicide. And we just, in honor of him, we have just always said, and always, I think, hope emergency management people stay in touch with those people that go through that kind of thing and realize, how desperate we need each other. It's not something somebody as a bureaucrat can handle. You have to be in conversation with the people you want to help in some way. Not that it's like we go have a drink together or something, but that wouldn't be too bad. But it's to have some communication, or you feel that you can call FEMA or write FEMA or your state agency or your local agency. In Arkansas now, there are several cities that have viable city emergency management offices. I'm really proud of them because I know that is expensive, but they do it, and they need to, because we have a lot of disasters in this state. But I'm still sorry I don't live here all the time.